A nearly 46-year-old mystery finally solved. A killer identified in the case of murdered teenager Carol Sue Klaber.
In the quiet state of Kentucky, a mystery began on June 5, 1976, with the sudden disappearance of a 16-year-old girl named Carol Sue Klaber. Her disappearance left her family and the entire community of Boone County in northern Kentucky devastated. For decades, her case remained unsolved despite some initial leads and suspects. But then, in a dramatic turn of events, investigators found DNA evidence, a crucial clue that could finally lead them to her killer. As detectives delved deeper into the case, the mysteries started to unravel. So how did DNA help solve the case after decades? How did the killer escape from the police for such a long time? Welcome back to Cold Case Files, where we cover notorious cold cases from history. Today, we'll delve into the mysterious case of Carol Sue Klaber, a 46-year-old cold case that was finally solved in 2022. But first, if you are new to the channel or haven't subscribed yet, please consider clicking the subscribe button, as it helps us and motivates us to create more content for you. So without further ado, let's dive right into this mystery. Boone County is located in the northern part of the state of Kentucky in the United States. It is part of the Cincinnati-Middletown Metropolitan Statistical Area and is home to the Cincinnati Northern Kentucky International Airport. The county has a population of around 133,000 people and is known for its natural beauty, parks, and outdoor recreational activities, such as hiking, fishing, and golfing. The county seat is Burlington, and the largest city is Florence. Boone County is also home to many businesses, including several Fortune 500 companies, making it a hub for commerce and industry in the region. In the small town of Fort Wright, Kentucky, a baby girl named Carol Sue Klaber was born on November 28, 1959. She was welcomed with open arms by her parents, Daniel Henry Klaber and Betty Jane Meek Renneker, and her older brother Thomas Klaber. Before her life was tragically cut short, Carol Sue Klaber was a vibrant and talented student at Dixie Heights High School. She was a valued member of the school's quartet, where her violin skills captivated audiences and earned her admiration from her peers. With her outgoing personality and friendly nature, Klaber was well liked and popular among her classmates. The enigmatic nature of her personal history leaves many wondering who she was beyond the headlines. However, a glimpse into her personal life is provided by her elder brother Thomas Klaber. He remembers her as a girl who found joy in life's simple pleasures. She was a gentle soul with a deep love for her family. With a laugh that could light up a room and a smile that could melt hearts, Klaber was known for her carefree spirit and infectious energy. She was a natural comedian, always cracking jokes and bringing joy to those around her. Her brother fondly remembers her as a ray of sunshine, someone who never let life's troubles bring her down and always looked for the silver lining. But little did she know that her happy existence would soon be ended. On the summer day that was June 5, 1976, as the county awakened in the early hours of the morning, a tragedy befell the community of Boone County, Kentucky. Dr. Gaines Huey, a respected dentist in Walton, a town about 17 miles away from Fort Wright, was making his way to work on that fateful morning. Little did he know that he was about to stumble upon a grim discovery. While driving down Chambers Road, a quiet stretch located in the heart of southern Boone County, his eyes were drawn to something unusual at the edge of the road. It was a body, lifeless and motionless, lying right next to a culvert that served as a drain pipe for rainwater. In a moment of panic and with a racing heart and trembling hands, Dr. Huey quickly dialed the number for the Kentucky State Police and reported the horrifying scene. Luckily for him, Trooper Jan Wushner, who had also served with the Boone County Sheriff's Department, was at hand and was dispatched to the location to investigate. The detectives from the Walton State Police Department arrived at the crime scene and swiftly got to work, carefully examining the body and the surrounding area. They found injuries on her body that suggested she had been attacked and strangled, leaving investigators to conclude that she had likely been killed elsewhere before being left at the scene. The investigation also uncovered evidence of a heinous assault, further emphasizing the sheer brutality of the crime. They were able to reach out to one of the family members of the victim and asked him to identify the body. Thomas Klaber, the brother of the victim, summoned the strength to identify his beloved sister, Carol Sue Klaber. However, what he saw was something that would haunt him for a lifetime. The brutal sight of his sister's battered and lifeless body was etched into his memory, causing him to live in a state of perpetual fear and agony for the next 5 decades. They combed the area around the crime scene, looking for any signs of something unusual that may have occurred around the same time. Every stone was overturned, every nook and cranny examined in a tireless effort to uncover any clues that could solve the puzzle of this heinous crime. The lifeless body of the victim was taken to the county medical examiner, who conducted a full autopsy. Tragically, the findings revealed that she had been strangled to death using brute force, and also beaten with a tire iron, which caused severe damage to her head. The medical examiner also found evidence that she was assaulted, indicating a sinister motive behind the heinous act. After careful examination, the medical examiner ruled the cause of death as asphyxia caused by manual strangulation and blunt force trauma to the head. They also found some traces of DNA on her clothes, which at the time they could only test against any possible suspects. The evidence was preserved carefully, with hopes that it would be useful in the future with the advancement of technology. The discovery of the body of Klaber was just the beginning of a mystery that would take investigators on a lengthy and perplexing journey. To crack the case, investigators started by reaching out to the people living in the vicinity, urging them to dig through their memories for any information that could lead to a breakthrough. They also talked to her family about any information that could lead them close towards the suspect. They learned that the previous day of June 4th, 1976 was a warm summer morning which seemed like any other day for the Klaber family in Fort Wright, Kentucky. Their 16-year-old daughter, Carol Sue Klaber, had spent the day leisurely riding her bike around town, soaking up the sun and fresh air. Later in the evening, she left her house at 5:30 p.m. as she had plans to meet a friend for dinner at Zino's Hyde Park restaurant. But as the sun began to set, a young man in a stylish Chevrolet Monte Carlo car accompanied Klaber to her home. According to a neighbor, the car was driven by a young man with sandy blonde hair who was slim and about 6 feet tall. The two chatted briefly before Klaber went inside her house, and the young man waited outside the house for her. Minutes later, she emerged from her home, got into the man's car, and drove away. Nobody could have known that it would be the last time anyone would see her alive. Investigators tried to find information about people who owned these cars in the area, but despite their efforts and the initial leads, the investigation into the brutal murder of Carol Sue Klaber hit a dead end. Every angle was explored, every possible motive was considered, but there was simply not enough evidence to piece together what had happened to Klaber on that fateful night. Despite their best efforts, the case eventually grew cold, leaving Klaber's family and friends desperate for answers and closure. After years of silence, a new spark of hope emerged in the investigation of Carol Sue Klaber's murder. In 2017, 2 cold case detectives from the Boone County Sheriff's Office, Coy Cox and Tina Adams, reignited the search for justice. Their determination led them to the original detective on the case, Jerry Keith, who had retired but never forgotten about Klaber's unsolved murder. Together, the 3 detectives delved back into the case, hoping to uncover new leads and bring closure to the case that had haunted them for so long. Cox and Adams started their search by looking into 2 suspects that Keith had identified earlier. The first suspect was a man who had previously stolen a car that matched the description of the one Klaber was last seen getting into. The detectives tracked down this man and questioned him extensively. However, he vehemently denied any involvement in Klaber's death and cooperated with the investigation, admitting to past wrongdoings but maintaining his innocence in Klaber's murder. Cox and Adams collected his DNA as part of the investigation and promised to eliminate him as a suspect if his DNA did not match the evidence found at the crime scene. After the DNA analysis, Cox and Adams made good on their promise and called the man to inform him that he had been cleared of suspicion in Klaber's murder. Despite his past misdeeds, he could finally put the case behind him and move on with his life, while Cox and Adams continued to search for the elusive killer. After exhausting all leads on their first suspect, the pair then decided to explore a new avenue of investigation. In 2020, they turned their attention to another individual who had committed a sexual assault in the nearby community just 2 years after Klaber's murder in October 1978. His name was Michael Dean Tate. Cox delved into the archives and meticulously pieced together the evidence, eventually identifying Tate as the perpetrator of the 1978 case. They found a crucial piece of evidence, a fingerprint on the victim's car, that linked Tate to the 1978 crime case on which Keith worked at that time. To clear their doubt, the investigators also contacted the victim of the October 1st, 1978 crime. But to maintain her privacy, her identity wasn't released. She told them it was a dark and quiet night in the Park Hills on October 1st, 1978, when she was brutally attacked in her own garage. As she stepped out of her car, a shadowy figure appeared out of nowhere and grabbed her from behind. What followed was a nightmare that lasted for 2 hours. Torture and unspeakable cruelty. Tate burned her with cigarettes and beat her relentlessly. With this breakthrough, Cox and Adams thought of Tate as a possible suspect in the Carol Sue Klaber case. Tate was known to travel to the area frequently for work in the 1970s and 1980s. But despite his criminal past and potential involvement in Klaber's murder, Tate denied any connection to her death. The detectives had high hopes of finally cracking the cold case. However, their hopes were dashed when the DNA found on Klaber's body did not match Tate's, and the court documents showed that Tate had been in Cincinnati in 1976. The detectives were once again back to square one, left to wonder if they would ever be able to bring closure to this decades-old mystery. The case that had remained unsolved for almost 5 decades finally saw a breakthrough when Cox and Adams reached out to Othram Labs for assistance in September 2022. Othram Labs, a genetic genealogy company, aids law enforcement agencies in their investigations by using DNA samples to find relatives of suspects. They sent the evidence to the lab after funding was secured for the testing of the evidence in collaboration with Season of Justice. It took less than 2 months, and in November 2022, they got an answer from Othram Labs. Through the DNA samples left by the killer, they were able to identify a genetic link to Thomas Dunaway, who had already died in 1990 and had a child who had grown up without knowing his father. The detectives traveled to meet the child of Mr. Dunaway's to collect DNA samples for comparison. The tests would prove to be the key to unlocking the identity of the murderer who had long eluded the law. It was a painstaking process, but through the use of cutting-edge technology and diligent detective work, the case was finally solved in December 2022. After almost 46 years, justice would finally be served for Carol Sue Klaber and her family. Despite the fact that the killer, Thomas W. Dunaway, who was 19 years old at the time of Klaber's murder, managed to evade justice for decades, the tireless efforts of the police did not go unrewarded. In their quest for answers, they were able to unearth crucial information about Dunaway's life and the atrocities he committed. Though it could not bring back the victim, their relentless pursuit of the truth shed light on a dark chapter of his past. Further evidence emerged that he lived in close proximity to DeVoe Park, where the young woman, Klaber, was spotted with a man who resembled Dunaway. The more they dug, the more incriminating evidence emerged. Thomas W. Dunaway was not just a one-time offender. He had been on a rampage for 6 months, committing crimes and then discarding the cars he had used to flee the scene. His criminal streak did not end with the murder of Carol Sue Klaber. He was also convicted of killing another person in Boone County just 6 months after Klaber's death. Detective Coy Cox uncovered Dunaway's pattern of violence, which left a trail of destruction and despair in its wake. Although justice may not have been served for Klaber's murder, the police managed to bring to light the dangerous and deadly life of Thomas W. Dunaway. It was a dark December night in 1976 when 19-year-old Ronald Townsend was found lying on the ground, riddled with bullets. 4 days later, he passed away, leaving behind a grieving family and a community in shock. But justice was served when Thomas Dunaway, the man responsible for Townsend's murder, was caught, confessed, and pleaded guilty. He was sentenced to life in prison, but unfortunately, the sentence did not last. Dunaway was released in 1984 after serving just 7.5 years behind bars, leaving many to wonder if justice was ever truly served. The gruesome murders of Carol Sue Klaber and Ronald Townsend had a startling similarity. Both were left in plain sight, mere inches away from the road, as if to taunt the public. Detective Coy Cox thought that it was as if the killer wanted to send a message. But as they dug deeper, they discovered something else about Dunaway. He was AWOL from the army when Townsend was killed. It was almost as if the law didn't apply to him, and he could commit heinous crimes at will. Thomas W. Dunaway had enlisted in the army 9 days after Klaber's murder and was stationed first at Fort Knox before being sent to Fort Carson, Colorado. But even the military could not keep him on the straight and narrow. Dunaway had a pattern of committing crimes, ditching the cars he'd driven at the time of those crimes and getting away with them. Thomas Dunaway's love for cars led detectives to his doorstep. In May 1976, Dunaway purchased a two-tone 1973 Chevrolet Monte Carlo, and shortly after arriving at Fort Carson, he traded it for an orange Chevrolet Vega. However, the trade did not shield him from the prying eyes of the law enforcement agents. Detectives investigating Townsend's murder issued an attempt to locate Dunaway and his flashy orange Vega. It was a chase that would culminate in his arrest on Christmas Eve 1976 in South Carolina on charges of setting someone else's car on fire and possessing an illegal firearm. It seems that Dunaway had a penchant for trading cars like baseball cards. First, he swapped his Monte Carlo for an orange Chevrolet Vega as soon as he reached Fort Carson. Then, he exchanged the Vega for an Impala, which he was caught burning with a sawed-off shotgun in South Carolina. It's as if he saw cars as disposable, using them to carry out his despicable deeds and then discarding them like yesterday's trash. But thankfully, through the diligent work of investigators, they were able to follow Dunaway's trail of twisted transactions and bring his dark past to light. The mysterious connection between Dunaway and Klaber still leaves investigators confused. While their paths may have crossed during their formative years in the Erlanger-Ellesmere Schools District, it is unclear how they became acquaintances later in life. However, Detective Cox has unearthed a crucial clue: Klaber's fondness for Devou Park. It seems she was a social butterfly, flitting from one conversation to the next with ease, and it's possible that's how she came to know Dunaway. Perhaps fate led them to that leafy oasis, and their paths intertwined as they shared stories, laughter, and the simple pleasures of a shared space. Despite the mystery surrounding their connection, one thing is certain. The park holds the key to unlocking their enigmatic bond, as Dunaway lived half a mile from the DeVoe Park, where Klaber often rode her bike. As Detective Cox revealed the long-awaited truth about the murder, the tension in the room was palpable. Klaber's brother let out a sigh of relief, finally able to find some closure after years of agonizing uncertainty. However, as the detective delivered the crushing blow, the perpetrator had died years ago in 1990 at the age of 33. The survivors were left to grapple with a devastating question. What does justice mean now? Thomas Klaber, the victim's brother, was left with a deep sense of regret, wishing he had the chance to confront the killer before his untimely demise. The truth had been uncovered, but the weight of the unanswered questions still lingered. Thomas Klaber never forgot the tragic death of his sister, a wound that refused to heal over the years. The pain was so profound that it affected not only him but his entire family, leaving behind a deep and lasting trauma. Despite the passage of time, the memories of that fateful day continued to haunt him, a constant reminder of the injustice that had been done. Looking back, Klaber wondered if seeking professional help would have helped him cope with the darkness that lingered deep within his soul. The terror of losing a loved one never truly leaves a person, as Thomas Klaber knows all too well. The memory of his sister's murder has haunted him for nearly 46 years, causing him to worry endlessly about the safety of his family. Even his son Daniel, who is 28 years old, can attest to the impact the tragedy has had on their family, as his father would often call him late at night, asking him to come home early or at least check in, because he always had the fear of losing his son, just like he lost his dear sister. But despite the lingering fear, there is a glimmer of reassurance for Thomas. He no longer has to worry about the police disturbing his sister's remains to obtain DNA evidence, as detectives were able to exhume the body of the killer instead. While justice may not be fully served in this case, identifying the killer has given Thomas a small sense of closure. Detective Cox's latest move in the long-running investigation of Carol Sue Klaber's murder is a daring one. He has obtained a court order to exhume the body of her suspected killer, who died in 1990 at the age of 33, to collect a DNA sample directly from him. This DNA will be entered into the combined DNA index system to determine if he may have been involved in other unsolved crimes. Cox is determined to leave no stone unturned in his quest for justice, and he knows that this step could reveal new leads and help bring closure to other victims' families. After almost 46 years, the family of Carol Sue Klaber finally received some closure. When Detective Cox informed her brother, Thomas Klaber, that the killer had been identified, Cox's eyes filled with tears as he described the moment. Thomas's body relaxed and a wave of relief washed over him. "I have closure," he said, and his voice was audible and filled with emotion. While the killer can no longer be brought to justice, Boone County Commonwealth's attorney, Lewis Kelly, considers the case closed. For Thomas Klaber and his family, the knowledge of the killer's identity brings some measure of peace after years of uncertainty and pain. The tragic murder of Carol Sue Klaber haunted her family and the community for over 4 decades. Thanks to the persistence and dedication of Detective Coy Cox and his team, they finally identified the perpetrator as Thomas W. Dunaway, who already had a history of violence and crime. While justice may not have been served in the traditional sense, the revelation of Dunaway's identity brings a sense of closure and resolution to the case. This case reminds us of the tireless efforts of law enforcement to bring justice to victims and their families, even decades after the crime was committed. What are your thoughts on this case? Share your opinions in the comments section below. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more captivating true crime stories. Until next time, stay safe and keep your eyes peeled for the next mystery to unfold.